Good evening, everyone. Boa noite. Welcome back to the series Brazil 200 Years of Independence, History, Language, and Culture. The topic this week is the languages of Brazil, and it's presented by Dr. Joanne Ferreira from the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus, and is hosted by me, Marco Schaumloeffel. I teach Portuguese at the Barbados Community College, and this series is an initiative by the Embassy of Brazil in Bridgetown and the Barbados Language Centre, Barbados Community College. So welcome back, everyone. So tonight we will have a presentation by Dr. Joanne Ferreira. Joanne Ferreira is senior lecturer in linguistics at the St. Augustine campus, University of the West Indies. She has a BA in language and literature French from the University of the West Indies. She also has a PhD from the University of the West Indies and a postgraduate diploma, which we call especialização in Brazil, in Brazilian indigenous languages and linguistics from the Museu Nacional or Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro. And Dr. Ferreira, she researches on Portuguese language and culture in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean, French lexicon Creole in the Southern Caribbean and Northern South America, and phonetics and phonology of Caribbean varieties of English. So Dr. Ferreira could not be here with us today live, but we recorded a conversation and a presentation she made yesterday. And that is what I will play now, and later I will open the floor for questions and discussions. Okay, so enjoy tonight's session.
Hello, everyone. My name is Joanne Ferreira, or Joana Ferreira, if I'm in Brazil, and it's my pleasure and honor to be here today at the invite of Dr. Marco Schaumloeffel. And you know that this is a big celebration of Brazil's bicentenary. And we're also in the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, 2022 to 2032. So I'm happy to talk a little bit about the huge language diversity of Brazil. Brazil is huge, language diversity is huge, everything about Brazil is huge. So happy to talk about a little bit of this today. So as we know—
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Ferreira. Welcome. So in the name of the Embassy of Brazil in Bridgetown and the Barbados Language Centre of Barbados Community, I welcome you and I thank you for accepting this invitation. Yes, let's go ahead. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Thank you very much, and parabéns ao Brasil, and thank you to the Embassy and the College, and greetings to all viewers and students. So as we know, Brazil is one of 9 officially Portuguese-speaking countries in the world. It's the biggest, and over 200 million people in Brazil. It's also CARICOM's biggest neighbor, because as we know, Guyana, Georgetown and Guyana is the headquarters of CARICOM, and both Guyana and Suriname belong to CARICOM, and so Brazil, and both border Brazil, so Brazil is our biggest neighbor. So hello neighbors, congratulations, parabéns. Did you know that apart from Portuguese, Brazil has 237 other languages? So in total, 238. That's an amazing number. According to the statistics and the language counts vary, but this is one of them, fairly authoritative. There may be differences of opinion, but in general, there are over 200 languages in Brazil, and ethnologue.com counts 238, including 217 that are alive. Some are alive and well, some are barely alive, some are nearly extinct, and there are 22 that are actually extinct. And they're counted because they are recently extinct. So if we had to count all the other languages that have died in the past, then that's a whole other discussion. But the exciting thing about the living languages is that at least 200 of them are indigenous, native to Brazil and other areas in South America, and 17 are non-indigenous. And we'll explore what non-indigenous means, where the other languages came from. And altogether, 7 languages have been granted institutional status. That means they're either official or national, or They're used and allowed at the municipal level, at the state level, so can be used in education, in media, in courts of law. Some are developing, so they have their own alphabets and orthography, starting to be used in education. Others are in vigorous and strong use. Some are definitely in trouble because the elders are dying, and 97 others are dying because the children aren't speaking the languages anymore. So, and we also have other languages whose status is uncertain. So lots of languages, lots to talk about. So here we go. As we know, Portuguese is the official and national language of Brazil. At last count, there were some 211,200,000 users of Portuguese in Brazil. And we also have Libras, which is Brazilian Sign Language. It's the national sign language of Brazil, the official sign language of Brazil. And you have anywhere from 630,000 users of the language to over 9 million. So that's a lot. And you'll see Libras being used in very official contexts as well. So no other sign languages may come in once in a while, but this is the official sign language of Brazil. There are 22 co-official languages, including these are the better known, and these are the ones that have been around as co-official since 2003 or more. So almost 20 years now that Brazil has been seeking co-official status for other languages. So among them, we have 3 indigenous languages, Baniwa, Ningatu, and Tucano. And as you'll see, populations are fairly small, but they're all centered in the municipality of São Gabriel da Cachoeira in the Amazonas state. So the Baniwa, again, Baniwa, Ningatu, and Tucano are indigenous. I have them here in alphabetical order. Then we also have 2 European languages of European immigrants, Pomerano, or Pomeranian in English. Yes, there is a language called Pomeranian because we know about Pomeranian dogs, same way we know about Alsatian dogs. But there's no longer a country called Pomerania. But we'll talk about that more in a little while. And we also have a language from Italy called Italian or Italiano. And Pomerano is spoken further north in Espírito Santo, and Italiano is spoken further south in Rio Grande do Sul. So how do we get to a place where we tend to think of Brazil as Portuguese speaking, but yet there's so much obvious diversity, maybe hidden diversity, such huge variation? So we'll touch briefly on how these languages came to be concentrated in this one big space, Amerindian language families and the languages involved, and some other interesting things like influences on Portuguese vocabulary from different languages in the Amerindian language families and African ones too. So long before 1550, there were millions of indigenous peoples. We call them Amerindians in English. Some people don't like that name. So we can stick to either indigenous or autochthonous, whichever one. But from 1550, 4 million enslaved Africans were taken to plantations and mines in Brazil. And they were speaking many, many languages. 15 is just the bare minimum. And of those languages, Arabic was included because some of them were Muslim and quite literate in Arabic. In fact, it's said that some enslaved Africans were literate and some of their slave masters were not. So that's an interesting fact. And of course, we're celebrating 30 September, 7th of September, and Brazil becoming an independent monarchy. So the context is the Portuguese went to a place with millions of indigenous people speaking thousands of languages. And so you had the contact first between the indigenous peoples and the Europeans, and then Africans came in, and let's see what's going to happen.
Yeah, Joanne, may I interrupt
yes.
you?
Sure.
In one of our sessions, we actually touched this topic of Arabic, and we even saw when I presented actually on the Afro-Brazilians that returned to West Africa, that they even organized a revolt using the Arabic language to organize it because the masters didn't know that language. So it was even instrumental in revolting against the masters in Salvador da Bahia.
That's wonderful. That's very interesting, and it just shows that, I mean, everything that a lot of the negative effects that we see from slavery, people looking down on enslaved people. First of all, I mean, we don't need to look down on anybody. But if you're going to look down on anybody, why do we continue to victim blame and shame? It's the perpetrators who should be crucified. But no, people have these really strange ideas that, oh my goodness, you know, we had educated Africans. Well, of course we did. I mean, we have huge civilizations in Africa and in Europe and in the Americas and in Asia. You know, it's a human thing. So, but flashing back to one of the languages that is still around and been made co-official in just one part of Brazil, but it has a very long history in Brazil, Ningatu, which means good language in a Tupi-Guarani language. And two languages were, let's say, sort of created by the Jesuits to help facilitate communication. The Língua Geral Paulista is now extinct, and Língua Geral, also called Língua Brasílica, and Ningatu. These were used in the 17th and 1600s to 1700s as a lingua franca between indigenous peoples. So indigenous peoples had to learn it, and the Portuguese had to learn it, and it was a means of communication. So some indigenous peoples learned Portuguese, some Portuguese learned this lingua franca, and it was around for quite a while. So in 2003, as I said, it became a co-official language in one of the biggest states of Brazil. The decline of the language as in widespread use, because as I said, now it's sort of narrowed to a certain part of Brazil. It was much more widespread. When the Marquis de Pombal imposed Portuguese in Brazil in 1758, and then the Jesuits had to leave, there was also the increasing immigration from Portugal. There was a constant movement, and Portuguese started to become more and more prominent to the detriment of Ningatu. So to me, it's interesting that an indigenous language was so easily accepted by colonizers, and I don't know if Marco wants to talk about that later, but you can see how people came in and accepted names of flora and fauna, names of different topographic things, accepted the whole language, developed whole languages, and then because of politics and nationalism and other issues, and more people speaking Portuguese, they became less reliant on Ningatu.
And again, Joanne, I may interrupt you. What is interesting here, what is interesting in this case here is that Ningatu lost ground and Portuguese was more or less imposed again for the same reason, because they were fearing that the educated Amerindians, and also that's why the Jesuits were expelled, that the highly educated Amerindians, or indigenous people of Brazil, as they want to call them, they were fearing that they would again also revolt and try to get independent from the Portuguese and perhaps even expel the Portuguese. And that is why this oppression came in and enforcing Portuguese and disappearance of the lingua geral. That is also, it's always, those reasons, language as an instrument can become dangerous if it is allied to education, right?
Exactly, because there'll be socio-political and socio-economic motives to keep a language or to dispense with it. So you can use a language, as you said, as an instrument to conquer, divide, and rule, to unite, and it becomes symbolic of the power behind the language. Whoever's speaking the language or using the language has that power to oppress people via language, and it's really interesting how it's totally synergetic, if that's a word, So thanks for all these insights, because I'm glad that we're having this conversation, because sometimes I forget some details, sometimes there's some things I just don't know, and I really appreciate these connections. So
yeah, sure.
Thanks. So I should actually just boast a little that Marco was one of my students. So hey, so this former supervisor is very proud and happy to collaborate in this way.
I'm also proud to have you as my former supervisor.
Thank you very much. So we know that in Brazil, slavery ended fairly late. But when it did end, there was mass immigration from Europe, many countries in Europe, many different languages, and also Japan. So Brazil is the biggest Japanese-speaking country outside of Japan. And I actually had the privilege of going to the Museum of Immigration in Sao Paulo a few weeks ago, and it was absolutely amazing to see. I mean, it's like the Ellis Island. Sao Paulo had like the Ellis Island of Brazil. So you see where people came in and the kinds of things that they wore and they did, and there's lots and lots of immigration, especially through Sao Paulo. So I suppose Marco, you could talk about that. They shift from the north to the south and so on. But anyway,
Yeah,
so this is all.
we actually like this historic part, Joanne. We covered a lot of it already in the series when we told our specific focus is history. So
Right.
people already know about this immigration patterns from Europe and so. But it's interesting because it all comes together. And today you're also talking about the language aspect of it. So it's interesting.
And the language is the part that excites me, of course, the most. I mean, I marvel at the historical context, and that's absolutely crucial. We can't live without it. But when we drill down to the details of language and how people use language and how people retain or lose or hold on to bits of it, it's just absolutely fascinating. And to me, it's almost like a cocktail party topic of conversation. People always want to know about etymologies. They want to know where words came from. Why do we speak this way? Why do we have this accent? Why do we have these words? Why do we have these surnames? All these questions, and it all comes together. What do names mean? All these things. And I mean, I've seen conversations about somebody once asked me, what's an Amerindian word for guava? I was like, but guava is an Amerindian word because there are no guavas in Europe. So,
Yeah.
so we have these Eurocentric points of view that we don't realize that so I mean, we have things like pineapple, which makes no sense. Why don't we, in English, why don't we have abacaxi or ananas? Because things that are native to an area, you do one of two things with them. You either impose your name on it, or you adopt wholly or partially what's already there. And the thing is, Brazil had so many languages that the languages that gave words to Portuguese, you'll see how they were the ones in contact with Portuguese versus the others that were. So it's the coastal languages and the ones that had big populations that had that impact on Portuguese.
The other day, Joanne, I had a friend coming over to my place, and I have a big tree in the backyard, and it's a starfruit tree. And I tried to explain the Guyanese friend, "Oh, look, this is a starfruit tree." And she said, "But starfruit, what is that?" And I tried to explain and say, and then I said, "Well, but in Portuguese we also call it carambola." And she said, "Oh, carambola, I know carambola." Yeah, but starfruit was not familiar. So anyway.
Yeah. I was about to say, I was kind of scratching my head, and I was like, what is starfruit again? Because it's carambola for us too. Because it's like, at least and then we have something called star apple, which is kaimit in our English, which is from kaimito, that the Spanish borrowed from an Arawak language, I think. So, there's no kaimit, there's no carambola in Europe. So words have been borrowed, and I'm glad they've been borrowed. So I remember one time I was in Brazil and somebody offered me acerola juice. I'm like, okay, this tastes nice, but it tastes so familiar. What is it? I didn't know the word acerola. And it's only when I was passing through Miami and I was in a Hispanic grocery store and saw acerola juice and I saw West Indian cherry or Barbadian cherry. I was like, oh, I have that in my backyard. So it's just that, sometimes Europeans would take names like cherry and put it on different cherries, berries, plums, and apples. Those four things seem to keep finding themselves in French and English and other languages because they didn't ask people, what is this in your language? They just said, oh, it looks like this, so let's call it that. Anyway, so so we had all this amazing immigration, a wonderful museum. If anybody ever goes to Sao Paulo and wants to know about this. And then, of course, you can wend your way over to the Museum of the Portuguese Language in Sao Paulo, and you have a full experience of Brazilian language history. So I just want to mention Getulio Vargas. Nearly every city in Brazil that I've visited has a street in honor of Getulio Vargas. I'm sure you'll have talked about him. That 1930 revolution was very important sociolinguistically speaking, had huge economic, political, and cultural impact. And it came to the point where Portuguese was made very prominent. Everything else was denied a place because Vargas saw linguistic diversity, and I'm quoting here from Sachs et al., saw linguistic diversity as a sign of national fragmentation, and so prohibited the teaching of the immigrants' mother tongues to their children. So if the Amerindian languages were going into decline, the African languages were certainly banned on estates and plantations, even though people would have continued in the quilombos for a long time after, and the Arabic we just talked about. And of course, the immigrants were the next set of people to be targeted. So literacy programs, primary school programs in Vargas's era were in Portuguese only. All right. So to continue, school and language were the means for constructing a national identity, or as it was put, the mental unity of the nation. So if we wanted to feel Brazilian and be Brazilian, Portuguese was the symbol of national identity, and it had to get into people's psyches. So hence the term mental unity. So radio began to help spread the Portuguese language far and wide. I remember going to different villages in different Amerindian areas where cable television, not cable, satellite television was quite available, and everybody would gather around at between 7 and 9 to watch the news, national news, and look at the telenovelas before and after. So if that was in the 2000s, you can imagine that the spread of radio being much cheaper than satellites, was really managed to penetrate areas that hadn't even faced Portuguese before, and supported Portuguese in areas where Portuguese was in a bi and multilingual condition. Cinema was dominated by the US at one point under the Good Neighbor policy, but that changed in the 1950s with the development of Brazilian cinema, Brazilian theater. Well, theater is much older, but then Brazilian cinema and Brazilian telenovelas. There were photonovelas as well in the papers. And of course, images accompanying language. The whole audiovisual impact is great. So from print to radio to television. So we turn to the Amerindian language families.
May I just interrupt you again, Joan, before you go to the Amerindian languages? As you said, like the role of radio and later the role of TV is very important in, like, well, I say, uniting Brazil. And the sign for it is, for example, that more people in Brazil have TV sets at home than fridges. I think it's like 99 point something percent of families have a TV set, and only 97 point something percent have a fridge. So that shows you the importance that even up to today, the TV has in Brazil.
So how do they cook? How do people cook?
It's a good question. Yeah.
If electricity goes there, it's like, oh my God, the fridge. The first thing is to protect the fridge. Yeah, but I'm even as a foreigner in Brazil, if I watch a Brazilian novella here, at home in Trinidad, via the internet now, and I show up in Brazil during the period of the novella or after or whatever, and somebody's cracking a joke about one of the characters in the novella, everybody knows and so I come along as a foreigner and I know what's going on, and people are like, but do you want to be Brazilian? Are you trying to be so it's a nice icebreaker. It is a unifier because people can connect and identify with something humorous, with something dramatic, and if everybody's on the same page and you have nothing else to talk about, it's really interesting. And in fact, when I was in Brazil, I remember my friends telling me, you need to watch Brazilian telenovelas. And I'm like, I don't want to watch soap operas. I don't even like The Young and Restless. They're like, no, it's not the same. The Young and the Restless is now going on for over 40 years, one so-called soap opera. But they said not only are Brazilian soap operas designed to have a beginning, middle, and an end, they're probably about 6 months long, a determined number of episodes, and more importantly, they touch on sociocultural themes, things of the period, the event, and they can relate to the teenagers, to families, to more adult themes. and the language always comes through. So I have learned so much by just and the good thing for foreigners who like to read is that many of these novellas are accompanied by their own websites. So you have little sneak previews. They have either snippets or clips from what's going to happen. So even if you don't understand it when you're watching it the first time, you watch it a few more times, you can read what's going on. Some of the text is quoted, and then you go back and you could kind of consolidate what you. So it's a whole learning experience, and it's a whole connecting thing. And I suppose I should start watching Travessia anytime now because I think it looks quite good. I like some of the actors.
Yeah, it is actually very common that you, for example, go, let's say, to a bus stop, and complete strangers start talking about this common friend they have, and they talk about this person all the time, and then you realize they're not talking about the real person, but the character in the telenovela, and cursing the character or saying, "Oh, he's such a nice guy," and something like that. So it's very common in Brazil, as you say.
But that was my experience with the Young and the Restless. Many years ago, when I was going up in an elevator on my campus, and people were bad talking some characters, and I'm like, how could you be exposing your friend's business like this in public? I had no clue that this was but people were so connected, and then they say the dialogue in these things is so simple that people of different um capacities or different interests can still connect because it's easy to work with. It's when you down tools, it's when you relax. But it's much more interesting in Brazil, the way because it's more dynamic. I mean, those American soap operas that last forever. I mean, I think they're into great grandchildren by now, probably. So, but the Brazilian telenovelas, anybody who's learning Portuguese, I happen to like the global ones. Not everybody does, but maybe Marco at the end of this can recommend the other ones. And of course, there's some classics that can
You're
be
actually
downloaded.
giving me you're actually giving me some ideas. Perhaps we will have a session dedicated to telenovelas in analyzing the role they play in society. So I will think about that. So it's interesting. Yeah.
I think it'd be great because Sean, who already talked about Bayan and other cuisine, um, he's talked about that in his introduction to Brazilian culture courses. And I don't know if he looks at it like cinema, theater, and the whole mass media thing, but telenovelas to me are really interesting. And even giving people an idea of some of the classics, some of the ones that have gone to Portugal and Colombia and Venezuela and been translated into Spanish in those places. It's a whole it's an amazing thing that you can't leave out of your experience as a language learner. And if
I've
you're
seen Brazilian telenovelas in Russia. Believe me or not.
okay, that's exciting. That's to tell you. It's really well crafted stuff. I mean, some of these storylines, like, okay, what happened there? And then what to me is interesting is that COVID did a number on some of them, and they had to kind of pre-record as opposed to record as you go along. And I thought the recording as you go along was very interesting. That you have a script that can be modified, keep the suspense going, keep people excited because nobody really knows which of the 5 endings that's predicted is going to happen. But anyway, the point is that for language
Yeah.
learners and language lovers and culture lovers, you can see how your own Portuguese can improve by radio, music, and other aspects of audiovisual media.
And I think
So,
you, Joanne, are a perfect example of that because you didn't speak Portuguese at home, right? So you learned it as a foreign language, and I can tell everyone here that Joanne speaks perfect Portuguese. So the telenovelas must have played a role there as well.
I don't know about perfect, but I think they did, and you actually surprise yourself when it's like you learn things and you don't know you're learning. So it's like you hear a word and you know perfectly what it means in context because there's all these audiovisual aids, and then you see it in writing. It's like, oh, I learned that word, and I remember when I learned it from a novella. So,
Yeah.
I remember during COVID. There were some reruns, and I was looking at some, and I was like, but I didn't understand that then, but now I understand it. And it's like, when did I actually learn this? So some things you can pinpoint, but yeah, so I think it helps a lot. And I thank my friends and Marco for this great advice. So in the decade of indigenous languages, we look back that in the 1500s, there were anywhere between 2 and 6 million people belonging to more than 1,000 different nations, tribes, ethnic groups, peoples, whichever term you prefer. Now, I should say that tribo in Portuguese is perfectly acceptable. Etnia as well, nações, but in English, people don't really like the word tribes, so I'll try to stick to ethnic nations or something like that. Anyway, so you can see that there were lots of people. In terms of numbers of languages, estimates range from 1,500 to about 2,000 languages. And when we talk about languages, we're not talking about dialects of languages, we're talking about languages with their own dialects and languages that differ on the basis of gender, geography, status, all these things. So Darcy Ribeiro, well known in Brazil, and I hope around the world. Sorry for this fiddling with my screen. He stated that more than 80 indigenous peoples have disappeared in the first half of the 1900s alone. So if we can see and witness tangible evidence that almost 100 ethnic groups have disappeared in 50 years last century, we can imagine that there were many more who disappeared that we have no idea about. According to Ribeiro, the total population decreased from 1 million in the 1900s to about 200,000 people. The figures have changed since then, so the estimates change, but I just want us to get the perspective that there were many, many languages across this vast area, and many different languages spoken among millions of people. My psychocomputer. So today, in the 21st century, estimates for the total number of speakers of the 200 plus indigenous languages that we mentioned are found only among under 1 million people. So there are actually under 1 million indigenous Brazilians, and they're divided up among 305 ethnic groups. And I should say here that if people are asking, well, how do you have 200 languages and 305 ethnic groups? Well, you can be ethnically Tatere Mawe, you can be ethnically Baniwa. In other words, your parents speak it, your parents are both Baniwa, and you don't speak it. So you can be ethnically part of a language group, but not a speaker. So a typical example would be an Irish American who doesn't speak Irish, an Indo-Trinidadian who doesn't speak any Hindi or Bhojpuri. So we have ethnic groups that no longer have an indigenous language, ethnic groups that share an indigenous language with another ethnic group, but they're separate nations, and ethnic groups that speak mainly Portuguese. So it's a lot of variety going on. So from the 200,000 that, flashback here, sorry, 200,000 people that Ribeiro mentioned, or Ribeiro in English, we now have about 900,000 people. So overall population has been growing, but according to SIL International, about half the groups have a population of fewer than 500. So half have more than 500, half have fewer than 500. So very small communities, small villages. But even in some small societies, once the language is being passed on and transmitted to the children as their first language, there's hope for the language to survive. If there's pressure from education and society, then that's another matter. But it really all starts with the home. And down comes the rain again. So in this century, there are anywhere, some estimates, we already said that the ethnologue has 200 languages. Some estimates still keep it as low as 170. And some say 300,000, some say 900,000. And as I mentioned, the different sets of Portuguese-speaking ethnic Amerindians, but there are also millions of Brazilians who have Amerindian ancestry and don't speak an indigenous language. But what is constant, more or less, is that there's a recognition that there are 22 to 24 distinct language families in these nations and tribes. And why is that important? It's important because Indo-European is one language family, yet we have languages as different as Russian and Celtic and German and Portuguese. Those are all those languages I just mentioned. We have to take time to go to school to learn these languages, because if I speak English, it doesn't mean that I automatically speak Danish or German or Swedish. They belong to my sub-language family, and then we all belong to this bigger, massive language family, which is Indo-European. So if Indo-European, which has 400 and something languages, has so many distinct languages, what about 22 to 24 distinct language families? So it's like having 22 to 24 Indo-European language families, all in Brazil, and each language within each family is different. Now, some families have only one language. Some families, not even families at all, they're isolates. But I just want to say that the way we look at languages in the Indo-European dominated world, we don't even know that Sanskrit is related to German and that German is related to Italian. We don't know. We don't think of those things. We see them as all very different. We see everybody else's languages as just these blobs and blurs. But these language families in Brazil are each of them composed of distinct languages. And I think that's important to recognize that we don't know a lot. And I personally would love to know a lot more. I had the privilege in some 20 something, how many years ago? I was in the Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, in the Museu Nacional, the Federal University of Rio, where I did postgraduate diploma in Indigenous Languages and Linguistics of Brazil. So I'll mention one of my teachers later on. And it was a huge privilege to try and break some, not stereotypes, but not even misunderstandings, but just you feel much more enlightened when you realize that there's a whole world out there that you just don't know. The world is not European languages. We're communicating in one now. They're very important. I teach courses on European languages, and I think they're amazing. But the whole point is that all languages are amazing. Anyway, that was not a plug, but a side rant. So there are at least 11 other languages that don't belong to any language family in Trinidad and Tobago. If anybody listening from Trinidad, we have that situation because we talk about Carib and Arawak, but we have in the Carib family, we had about 7 languages, I think. In the Arawak language family, we had a number of other languages. We also have a language isolate, which is Warao. And Warao is spoken in the Orinoco Delta. And we still have it here in Trinidad. But Warao is not related to any of the other languages. And just like so in Brazil, there are at least 11 known isolates that don't belong. It's like, if you want a comparison in Europe, it's like Basque between France and Spain. That is a language that's not related to French or Spanish, not related to anybody else. It's a language isolate all by itself. Nobody knows much of, where did Basque come from? And there are also at least 70 uncontacted ethnic nations in Brazil. So may it stay that way for a while. It's up to them if they want to be contacted. But I'm not sure of the language situation of those groups. So very complex, very diverse, very exciting. So these are the languages of Brazil. So the indigenous languages, as I mentioned, there are that many, 200 from 224 language families. Of the Indo-European language family, there are about 5 languages, including a mixed Gypsy language. The Asian languages, including Japanese, Korean, and Chinese. And there are Creole languages, Kafundo, Caripuna, which is a French Creole from French Guyana, basically. And also Haitian Creole, and sign languages, at least 2. They're unclassified languages, and they are dying languages and extinct languages. So I put this in alphabetical order. These are the language families. They're not all restricted to Brazil. I'll show you a map in a while. But you can see how the languages, the families range from Caravan has 31 languages. Jean has 16. Panoan has 26. Maipurian, which is Arawakan, has 55. So Arawakan and Caravan language families are some of the bigger ones. Then you have small ones like Kamakanan, which has only 1 language, Karaja, which has 1 language. So a language family, as I said, can have many, many distinct languages. It can have 1, it can have 2. And so these are the names of the families. And it's impossible for me to list all 200 languages here, but know that each one is governed or attached to a language family, and some not at all. This is an idea of how things have changed from the 1500s to the present. So you can see in the first map that everywhere there are no white spaces. The white spaces on the map on the right mean that those are not indigenous areas. But the whole of Brazil was obviously indigenous at one point, and you had Tupi-Guarani languages, Maipuri and Arawakan languages, Caraban, Pano, Tucano, and others all spread out all over Brazil. And you'll see that an interesting phenomenon on the right is that very few Amerindian languages are spoken on the coast. Why? Because the Portuguese and other Europeans came by boat, not by plane. And they came by big boats, not down the Amazon River. So it meant that a lot of the conquest and colonization, as you probably already discussed, started on the coast, pushed the Amerindians further and further inland. It happened here as well in the Caribbean. Any Amerindian groups that survived had to be forced to the mountains, like in Dominica, or forced to the mainland, like from Trinidad to Venezuela. In the States, they were forced into swampland. So it's the retreat. So some people were forced out, some people were living there anyway. So there would have been also clashes of cultures and all kinds of drama going on. But you can see the massive shift from an entire space covered by Amerindian nations to only pockets here and there, and difficult access pockets, because the majority of Brazilians don't live in those areas. Majority of Brazilians are still concentrated between Rio, Sao Paulo, and the coast and the northeast, and of course, different places like Belém and so on. So I'm not saying they're isolated. I'm just saying that they're not as populated as the bigger cities and so on. So this is how things looked like in the past, where all these nations and many more were spoken on the coast. And of course, we know the coasts are very beautiful. Those of us who come from islands, we love our coastlines. But these were the first points of attack. And therefore, these people were the most vulnerable. This is another view of the modern situation of the pockets. I think this is probably a little clearer, of interest to West Indians. We are in the Caribbean. We don't have any Caraban languages. We just have the name Carib. We have a few place names like Tobago. So this map is probably a little clearer. And for those who are in the Caribbean, you'll know that Caribbean is from the name Carib, and we don't have Carib languages here in the Caribbean. We know about the Arawak language family, but we don't actually think of it as a family. We just think of it as one language. There are many Arawakan languages, many Caribbean languages, and those are in red. And you can see how far the Arawakan languages move from the Caribbean through Venezuela, Colombia, Brazil, all the way to Peru, Arawakan and Bolivia. Arawakan languages are all over. Caribbean languages concentrated in Venezuela, Guyana, and Brazil. And Tupi is, of course, another important one because we even have Tupi words in our English. So this lovely map, we look at a more detailed map, and everywhere you see a number is the name of an indigenous language. And again, you'll notice that some of the numbers are concentrated in the center and in the east, sorry, the west. So Roraima, Amazonas, Rondônia, those states, and the whole Maranhão, Pará, they have much stronger indigenous influences than in Rio, Espírito Santo. You still have a few indigenous languages on the coast, but coastal, not too far from the coast, but not as many. But these are some of the languages of Brazil. Another view of how these language families are not just concentrated in one country. Chile seems to be the only one that doesn't seem to have these language families. They have some of their own. But the spread of the Caribbean languages in orange, the spread of the Arawakan languages in blue, is a mighty spread. And of course, the purple in Tupi. Tupi-Guarani is the most well-known language family, or the Tupian family in Brazil. And for obvious reasons, it's all over the place. So speaking about Tupian or Tupi, They have 76 languages, and the majority of them, 61 of them, are in Brazil, and Ningatu, which we mentioned, is one of them. And it's spread out in other countries. And Tupian has, the same way that Indo-European has subgroups, Indo-European has subgroups like the Romance or Italic language family. Indo-European has the Slavic family, the Celtic family. So Tupi-Guarani is a subfamily or subgroup within the Tupian family. And Tupi-Guarani alone has 51 languages. Gea, formerly called Macro-Gea, the majority in Brazil. The Arawakan languages spread out everywhere. Peru has the most, but Brazil has quite a lot. And Panoan has a majority in Peru, a number in Brazil. Caravan has most of them spread out between Brazil and Venezuela. Other families.
What is actually interesting?
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, John. What is actually interesting is that not so many people know this. In Paraguay, Guarani is official language, and actually, if you are in Paraguay and visit the place, you actually hear it. You hear it more. It's more common than Spanish.
At one point, people were calling it a diglossic situation, where Spanish had more prestige and Guarani had less, but it's changed. And I think from what I've heard, it's much more like the Canada situation in terms of both languages having prestige, but not like the Canada situation where French is concentrated in Quebec, but Guarani is all over the country. So, you know, it's the kind of thing, we know so much about our neighbors north of us, and we know so little about our neighbors south of us, which makes no sense. I know we have difficulty with airline tickets, very expensive. So it's a whole economic thing, because it's easier to import. So there's cultural laziness, where it's easier to import something in English, and English, of course, is one of the world languages, so you can get lots of material. I mean, if we think we have Hollywood, now we have Nollywood, we have Bollywood, we have all kinds of words. Okay, I also mentioning it's so much easier to borrow English language materials from other people, access to Spanish and French and so on. But the issue of the airfares and transportation to other countries, it's all economics, because I remember when, I'm sure y'all talked about this, when Go had a direct flight from Bridgetown to Sao Paulo. And it was so exciting for me. I was able to connect, but then I saw like 3 people on my flight. So obviously it couldn't be sustained, but there was such a lack of advertising. But the amount of stuff that we have in common with each other, and the amount of stuff that there is to learn, it really is worth it if we try to make these links happen. And I don't know who is going to have the political will and the economic backing to do it, but they certainly would have university support and embassy support and all kinds of things. So yeah, so these are some of the major families, and as I said, for Caribbean people, 2 of them stand out: the Arawakan group and the Caribbean group. And we'll see that we mentioned also Puerto Rico here. That language is officially extinct, but there's a huge movement to revive the Taino language and to even reconstruct it among Taino descendants across the Greater Antilles and elsewhere. So I should mention that the reason I mention that is because if a language has died or is dying, one way to bolster it and to give it some life, apart from the documentation of the language itself, is to look to its cousins, if it has no sisters or brothers or, you know, immediate relatives, is to look to its cousins, like in Brazil and in Colombia, in Bolivia, etc., to see what the languages have in common, what makes them Arawakan, and what could Taino in Puerto Rico actually borrow that is closer to its true self. So, and you know, like things like, how do you create words? How do you build your vocabulary? How do you express yourself morphologically in grammar and so on? So these connections, I think, are very important, and working with scholars and native speakers in Brazil and the Caribbean and beyond is very important. So other families that we may or may not have heard of, I think Yanomami is probably the one that most people have heard of because of Venezuela. There are 5 Yanomam languages, 2 of them in Brazil. Namiquara is maybe known to some Brazilians. Tucanoan includes the co-official Tucano. There's Arauan, Chapacuran, I can never pronounce this, Katukinan, and Murapiraha has one language alone. And I actually know some people who worked to learn Murapiraha, which is a very interesting language. So if we look at that, so that's just looking at the languages by their families. Now we can, and in alphabetical order, now we can look at the language families by their populations. And I try to put them from biggest families to smallest families. So these actual languages, these are not families, the families are in brackets. So Tikuna or Chikuna, that has 35,000 people. These are outside of some of the bigger ones. There are only like 3 really big language groups in Brazil, and the others could be as small as 2,500, so on. But Chikuna, Kaingang, Shavanchi, Kaiwa, Makushi, Terena, Guajajara, Kayapa, Baniwa, Sadere Mawe, Yanomami, Guarani, Karajan, Apurina. Many Brazilians have heard these names over and over again. And they're Arawakan, they're Caravan, they're Tupis, they're Jean, Yanomami, different families. Karaja belongs to its own family. No, not big groups, but if they have support, they can continue to thrive. So we also have, as I mentioned, we have language isolates, languages that have not been classified yet. We actually have languages that have been reclassified, which is interesting. So people thought that this was the name of a family and realized there's 2 separate families under one umbrella. Lots of things that linguists keep on trying to discover. And we mentioned the creoles, the sign languages, the different European. I mentioned only 5 that were prominent last time in the other slide in the European languages, but actually 21 spread across Brazil because of remember the mass immigration from Europe that we talked about. Afro-Asiatic languages, there's only 1, Austronesian, Asian, Turkic, and Uralic. So in terms of the European languages, so these are all from one language family, I should say. Okay, so as I mentioned, Brazil has 24 language families. These are all from one language family in Europe. The Indo-European family, Portuguese, the biggest group, of course, High German, Italian or Venetian. I'm sure you think of Venetian blinds. There's a connection. Pomeranian, Italian itself, Dutch, Plaudish, which is Low Saxon, and Polish. And there are others. So in case you're wondering where Pomeranian is, first time I met somebody who said they were Pomerano, I was like, I felt so ignorant. I am always very happy to be less and less ignorant because, you know, I'm from a country that people just don't know. So when they ask me, so where are you from? Togo? I said, no, that's in Africa. Where are you from? Tonga? No, that's in the Pacific. So people don't know my country, and that's no reason for me not to know other people's countries. In fact, it's a reason to want to know where is Pomeranian spoken. So Pomeranian, so the Baltic Sea, you'll see Sweden and the white up here, Denmark here, and then Germany and Poland side by side. These are modern boundaries, right? And so Pomerania was divided between Germany and Poland. There's no longer a country called Pomerania, but most Pomeranians are actually in Brazil now. And the language has been given co-official status in Espírito Santo. So in case we're wondering where Venetian or Italian or Italiano is spoken in Veneto or Veneto. I'm not really sure how to pronounce it. I'm not an Italian speaker. Up in the northeast of Italy, what we know as Italian is more in this area, in the Roman area. Italy also has many languages that we don't know about. Germany has many languages. In fact, all this business of calling a language German or Italian or English or French has to do with the nationalism, the expansion, the rise of nationhood in these areas, the unification. So using languages for unification is a long European practice. So what's interesting about Italian is that there are not so many native speakers as there are Pomeranian, but it's still a heritage language. So people are interested in preserving it and teaching it as much as possible. In is it Rio Grande do Sul? Yeah. So Plaudish and which Marco can talk more about, and he can talk more about Hunsrück as well. Spoken in all these countries of the world. So in the Americas, we have Belize, Bolivia, Brazil, Costa Rica, Mexico, Paraguay, and the United States. And we also have Plaudish spoken in Germany, of course, the motherland, and Kazakhstan. Did you comment on this at all, Marco, about the rich German heritage of Brazil?
I think we'll make a session on that, so I probably will talk about that.
Well, it's October, so we need an Oktoberfest before we finish on October.
It's happening right now in southern Brazil in a city called Lumina.
There you go. So lovely architecture, lovely food, lovely people, So
second biggest Oktoberfest in the world after Munich.
Well, there you go. Everything in Brazil is huge. So you could have a Thursday for 365 Thursdays of the year. No, sorry, 52 Thursdays of the year. We could be talking about some interesting thing about Brazil. It's just amazing. So let's look at Portuguese vocabulary. So some of this is not just about Brazilian Portuguese, because remember that Brazil and Portugal have had a long relationship, and there are Amerindian words in European Portuguese. There are African words in European Portuguese. But we look at the Arabic briefly and look at other European languages as well. Arabic is a language that played a huge role in the formative stages of both Spanish and Portuguese, and has given over 1,000 everyday words to Portuguese and Spanish, and English has borrowed some of them as well. So I'll just translate some of them. Some of them you might recognize. So you have things like açafrão, which is saffron. Alcohol is there. Algebra is there. All the al's, almanac. Rice is there for arroz. If you visited Portugal and Brazil, you know what azulejos.
Algodão, which is algodão. You got algodão, which is alcotum and became cotton in English.
Yes, that's cotton. Xadrez is
the same as açúcar became al-sugar became sugar in English.
Right? Exactly. Sorry, I forgot. Yeah, I forgot sugar. Did I put it in there?
Yeah.
Not in my list.
That's not there, but it's also part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just 1,000 words. It's a syrup for xarope. So some things we can see where English got them from. Other things that we didn't borrow at all. Something we need to learn. Not that English is everybody's reference point, but since I'm talking English. So that's just a touch of things. And as I said, if you go to the Museum of the Portuguese language, you'll see much more on how Arabic got in contact with the Iberian Peninsula and some of the other cultural and architectural influences still there. The Amerindian languages, of course, flora. So you have, I'm going to translate, you have pineapple, potato, cocoa, cashew, guava. Everybody knows about guarana now because of the United States, so they locked into it. Jacaranda, manioc, pawpaw or papaya, sapodilla, tapioca, and tomato. So the only one we didn't borrow in English was ananas and abacaxi. We borrowed everything else too. Fauna, of course, cuping, paca, piranha, and tatu. We have piranha in English, and we have tatu in Trinidad. Food, chocolate, moqueca, best one of my favorite dishes, moqueca, and mingau, one of my least favorite dishes. I'm allergic to milk, but moqueca is just the greatest thing I've ever tasted, especially with the pirão. I'm hungry. There are many other words. But the logic of flora and fauna words being adopted into any language is because you don't have them in yours, so you borrow them. So other things are useful as well. Other things like canoe and savannah, and there's hurricane as well. Spanish borrowed it with the H, Portuguese with the F, as typical. Everything in Spanish that's an H is an F in Portuguese because that's closer to Latin, etc. They didn't have savannas in Europe, hammocks, all these different things. All these are Amerindian words. Then we have names of people on a whole range of sociolinguistic domains. Cacique or Cacique, Gaúcho, Guri, and Xará. Toponyms, Ipanema, the famous Ipanema, Tijuca, Ceará, Pará, Paraná, Paraíba. Personal names, Arasi, Jandaya, Iara, Ubirasi, Janjira. I'm sure, Marco, you can tell me a whole lot more personal names. These are the ones I could just get the top of my head. There are lists on the internet, lists of indigenous personal names that you can choose for your children and grandchildren. They're very beautiful. And some of them, the meanings are known, and the meanings are not known. Just like in English, nobody really knows what Anthony means, Antonio. Nobody really knows, but they know it's a name that has a Greek connection that came in via Latin. So sometimes names won't be known. And I mean, even in English, names like Roderick, which is Rodrigo in Portuguese, it actually has a Germanic root. So you have Germanic names that came into Romance languages, Greek names that came into Germanic. Once you have people in contact, you'll have languages in contact. You'll always have a dynamic exchange of ideas, beliefs, information, and language. So we jump over to Africa now. Huge influence in Brazil is supposed to be the biggest Black country outside of Nigeria. Biggest everything outside of the original home. So the orange and the red areas, Niger Congo A, and the Bantu areas in the Niger Congo orange area, those are the big language families that moved over to Brazil through enslavement. Mainly, the red ones came mainly to the Caribbean with some influences from the orange areas, but Brazil had over 4 million Africans from all over. So in terms of what Brazilian Portuguese and Portuguese in general has borrowed from Mbundu, which is a Bantu language. There are other languages, but Mbundu is one of the better known. Kanjika, Dende oil that Sean talked about. Fuba, Dengu, and Gilo, all well-known foods. Kasula, everybody has a kasula if you have more than one child in your family. Moleki, boy, macaco, monkey, which is also in French Creole, macaque, marimbondo, and all these other names. Of course, the best known one here for all of us outside of Brazil is samba, and that is a Bantu word. Other African languages gave us things like from Yoruba, like Akaraje, Ashe, and Jaba. Ashe tends to be, people think about it in sometimes a religious way. Akaraje is also in the Caribbean through Accra or Akara. Banana came from Wolof. Inyami or yam came from Fulani and Twi. And all these different words came from many other languages. Let's see if there's anything. Boom boom, I think most people would recognize that. Yes, it means what it looks like. Tanga, maybe Vata Shinga. Okay. Not okay. A lot of the Baba is a word meaning like nanny. So, but a lot of Bagunsa is a great word to describe chaos and commerce. And what's interesting about Bahia is that even if there are hundreds of words of different African origins in all over Brazil, all over the Portuguese-speaking world, in Bahia alone, there are 5,000 words in fairly regular use of various West African origins. They are found in everyday Portuguese as well as religious language. And other African origins include Kwa and Ewe. All right, so lots of contributions from African languages. Influence from European languages. The majority, of course, came from Latin, classical Latin, vulgar Latin, all the varieties of vulgar Latin. Basque gave us cachorro for dog. European Portuguese prefers cão. Celtic gave us cerveja for beer. English as a more recent influence and gave us blackout, delete, design, stock, folklore, football, revolver, stress. Some of these are kind of negative words. French gave us colchetti, crochet, paletto, baton, filet, filet. And Italian, macaroni, pilot, carroza, and barraca. So Portuguese also contributed to English. English has words of Portuguese origin. And Portuguese gave words to English, not just from Portuguese itself, but it gave some of the words that it borrowed from other European languages, from other Amerindian languages, from African and Asian languages, and gave them to English. So these are some quick examples. We recognize most of them: albatross, breeze, cast, cobra, coconut, embarrass, marmalade, molasses, mulatto, monsoon and mosquito, pickaninny, savvy, zebra. All these words came with the help of the Portuguese into English. these are not Portuguese words, but Portuguese helped these words to come to English. Like I said, banana, yam, tank and teak, buccaneer, cashew, grouper, manioc, etc. Maybe Tupi, Araku didn't come via Portuguese, but came via another Amerindian language. But we do say Ruku in Trinidad for anato. How do Brazilians and other Portuguese speakers react to words of Arabic origin? Well, most people don't have a clue what are the Arabic ones, because there's so much part of Arabic, so much part of Portuguese, so much part of everyday use that they're ingrained in Portuguese and Spanish. French is still considered to be a little chic and elegant, and English is kind of cool. A lot of English words keep being adopted and not necessarily adapted in terms of adopted and adapted, because in the old days, Brazilian Portuguese would take an English word and spell it and respell it to reflect the Portuguese pronunciation. Now you have words being borrowed that aren't changed in spelling and don't really fit the Brazilian orthography. There's a lot to say about this. This is probably another discussion by an expert like Marco who can talk about it. There are atlases of the Portuguese of Brazil, where the different zones and regions of Brazil have their own atlases, their own distinctive vocabulary, and their own distinctive accents and phonology. So there are regional varieties in the north, from the Amazon to the northeast. Bahia is by itself. There's southern, further south of the absolute north. Baiano is considered between north and northeast, but it's kind of in the middle. True south is Rio Grande do Sul, São Paulo, etc. Those are very broad divisions, and then you have other ways of looking at it. But if you were to divide Brazil between north and south, this is one way of doing it. As I said, there are other ways. This is my former teacher, Marcus Meyer. We leave the link in the chat so that you can look at it. It's in English, and he explains in wonderful detail the issues surrounding indigenous language rights and the need and interest in revitalizing indigenous languages throughout Brazil. So some of these sources of information that you can also turn to: the Museu da Língua Portuguesa is online, the Instituto Camões, representing all of the Portuguese-speaking world, ethnologue.com, and Brazil has many, many websites that you can turn to find out more about Brazil's very, very dynamic language situation and language situations. So that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Ferreira. Very interesting presentation. So I will leave it there right now to allow some time for people to perhaps make comments and ask questions at the end of this hour of this recorded session. So thank you very much in the name of the Embassy of Brazil, the Barbados Community College, from me personally as well. So thank you very much, and I say ciao.
Ciao, ciao. Obrigada. Ciao.
Done. Okay, I'm back. So we are a bit late because the recording took a bit more than an hour, but I found it very interesting. I don't know what about you. So it is interesting that we learned that there are so many languages spoken in Brazil, and usually people, when they don't know so much about indigenous languages, they just think that Amerindians, they speak one language and that's it, right? So do you have any questions, any comments regarding this presentation? Yes, Len? Your microphone is muted.
Right. Yes. Good night.
Yes, good
There was the African aspect of the languages in Brazil. I have one question about that. Now, there's a type of music that I listen to called the choro. You know, the
Yes.
Brazilian musical form, which is in a simple way, it's a Brazilian blues. And that word choro seems to have come from an African root as well, because it means to cry in Portuguese, which sounds like blues, huh? But blues is really a musical form and not about sadness or a sad song. It's not a sad song. It's really about a musical scale that's played in Africa and so on. And that's how the blues and music and our Western music came out of that. But I'm asking this because I've seen very few references of the origin of that word. That word seemed to have come from an African word, which was spelled Xolo, which is Zolo, which meant a dance or like how the slaves used to get together and party or have a ball or whatever at the end of like our crop over or like a dance at the end of the week, just to relax. And the music, the
Right.
happy music that they would play or sing was the Zolo music, but it seemed to have been confused with XOXO or Shoro or XORO, and it seemed to have been somehow misunderstood or translated as Shoro. But Shoro is still a good word to the sense that it represents the blues form, and it means to cry,
Right.
which is
Right.
blues, which is technically what blues in its crude sense would mean, but really and truly, it really describes the musical form, the musical type, because it is that type of music is very similar um, to American blues, to the type of music, the type of rhythms, that African rhythms that are played throughout the Caribbean and North America and wherever enslaved Africans were taken. So I would have loved to speak to Dr. Ferreira to hear what she thinks about that or what she will say about that, because I listen to the music a lot and it's very, very interesting. The form, the music, the rhythm of it is very interesting. Even though sometimes you can listen to it and it sounds like classical music because you have Ernesto Nazareth, you have Hector Villalobos, who spent some time in Barbados here in around 1915 and wrote characteristic African dances. And it is said that he was influenced by Barbadian African music when he wrote that. One author says that. So those aspects of it, that cross-pollination, I would like to hear a bit more about. Thank you very much for listening to me.
But it looks like you're ready to present here in our session as well, because you're a real connoisseur of Brazilian music, especially choro. Yes, as for the word choro itself, I would have to do some research because I never really worried about the origin of it. But for me, in principle, I don't know of an African origin about it, but it's well possible. Like samba is a clearly word that comes from samba and African languages. So I would have to do some research on it. But choro is definitely, it's this mix, Afro-Brazilian mix that has some jazz elements in it and some classical music elements in it and some samba elements in it and all that
Yes.
together. And it has this component of being a bit bluesy. Yes.
Yes. Is
For
it
sure.
possible that you can get someone who knows a bit about the music? Because I always ask questions about the music and the culture. Is it possible that you can also include someone who can talk a bit about that? And it would be
Yes.
interesting because the linkages between the Caribbean and the Caribbean musical forms, North American musical forms, and the Shoro, Scott Joplin and all those. It would be interesting. It would be entertaining as well. And the first
Right.
time I was introduced to Hector Villalobos was at the Brazilian embassy right here in Barbados. They
Right.
had a session of guitar at the embassy, and it was beautiful. Thank you
And we
very
also
much.
and we also had already, if I'm not sure, it was a Choro trio that was here a few years ago, brought by the Brazilian embassy as well. That was also interesting.
Really, I didn't know about
Yeah,
that one. The,
yeah,
the,
yeah.
the, the next time I heard a whole lot of Brazilian music was via the American embassy when they had some American Brazilian musicians here at a school here. It was very beautiful, and they more or less played a lot of Ernesto Nazareth,
Oh yeah.
Odeon, all that music.
And
All
it
right.
looks you could do a presentation actually on Brazilian music, And why not? We could think about that, but let me see if I find someone that is a specialist. The problem is always finding someone that is a specialist and that can present in English as well. So I will see.
I
It's an
would
interesting
assist. I would assist them.
interesting suggestion. Yeah,
Okay. Thank you very much.
no problem. So any other questions or any other remarks? Marcia, remember some time ago, Marcia, you asked about why Brazilians speak so differently from the Portuguese in Portugal. So as you probably saw today in the presentation, we got exposed to so many languages in Brazil, and there is variation. And all the things that the Portuguese never got exposed to. So that is why we have a different kind of accent and everything, because we have influences from all over the place in our language, right? So perhaps that answers the question that you had like some, I don't know, 2 months ago.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, I got it.
Okay, any other remarks? If not, it's already 11 past, so I don't want to take all your night time here. So if there are no other observations, so thank you very much for being here again. It will be, obviously it is being recorded, it will be online tomorrow. And I hope to see you next week again with another topic. So I will let you know on Wednesday, as usual, what the topic of Thursday will be, okay? So, ciao, ciao. Good night. See you next week.
Boa noite.
Good night.
Boa
Bye.
noite.
Boa noite.